Hey everyone, and benvindo na casa do Julien. So welcome back into my house. That's the second floor outside. So that's gonna be my podcast room, I think. Not bad, eh? Today I want to talk about the sense of self. What do I really want to talk about? I want to talk about the Q training. I've been an athlete all my life, like you have to. An athlete. I've been into fitness, sports, training, all I think my entire life. Like I started my first sport where I got good, like national level. Like my team was soccer, and my team, it was the 13 arrondissement in Paris. We actually went to the European Cup for 11-year-olds. So I've been at it since I can remember, right? And I've built my life around training. And from a very, very early age, I understood, I think, a deep truth is that to be powerful mentally, you need to be powerful physically. You cannot, there is no divide between the two. And this is something, a concept that I found in embodied cognition from Carl Friston. I'll put the link to that to that piece. It's an interview we did for the BBC or something like this that was so interesting. Is that the brain does not function without the body. There is no distinction between the two. The brain is not a simple passive organ that receive information and then that is being analyzed and then transferred into thoughts, and then the thoughts go into action and the brain takes the body. That is not how this works. Everything is prediction versus observation. Back at it. The prediction versus observation really is the base of everything. Again, Carl Friston, all that stuff. I made so many podcasts about it, but there are ways to apply this practically, right, toward training, which what matter. Remember when Socrates said it is a shame for a citizen never to see the beauty his body is capable of, right? It's a bit that, but like, further, like I think it goes both ways. That I've always had that. I grew up with comic books and everything. I always had that fantasy of getting superpowers. I'm still working on it. So I don't know if it's a fantasy I guess it is a fantasy until I make it real, but I'm still working on it and I'm still pretty confident I'll get there. But anyway, that's another podcast. Like Shark Xavier, all that stuff. So which one would it be, right? But if you look even in superheroes, the powers are either physical strength or more mental strength. They really divided between the two, except for a few Omega mutants that have both. But for me, I understood even as a child that deep truth that one is not separated from the other. Like that is not how this works. In order to achieve mental strength, you need to achieve physical strength. But I think it works. I know it works the other way as well. You cannot achieve physical strength without achieving mental strength. And that part is talked about a lot, but I think we fundamentally misunderstand a very important part, at least in the fitness industry. And so what I want to do in this podcast is I want to, in a way, announce the Q training. What is the Q training? The Q training is a culmination of everything I've done, not just as a coach, but as an athlete from a kid. All my training put together, all my research, the studies put together, my experience as a coach, what I saw. It's really been what I've been trying to find since I'm a kid, to how to get the performance to the level I want it to be at, right? And how we get there. So I try at first physically, like everybody. I think like there has to be a better program, there has to be a better way of doing things, but I did not put into it the Q training, that idea of the fail. And I think this is one of the cornerstone of what any program should be, right? So I'm going to try to explain. This will take me many podcasts, but what I'm going to try to establish the foundation of the Q training in this podcast, so you understand how I'm looking at it. And the reason I want to do this is because we are having spectacular results with it. On myself, I'm the leanest I've ever been, but as you may have seen, I'm starting the Powerlifting Cycle, because I want to use the Q training toward powerlifting. The reason I stopped, I did 5 years, really hardcore with my coach and everything, I got some decent number. Not great, but decent number. Like 550, 250 kilo squat, 280 deadlift, so 620, and 400 pound and 180 kilo bench. So nothing crazy, but not bad either, right? But I was about like 105, 108 kilo at the time. Like I'm more like 99, 98 right now. Why? Because I move better. Like for jiu-jitsu, I was very strong at over 105, but I couldn't move the way I wanted. Now that I'm under 100 kilos, I move the way I want, but I've always struggled to be strong at under kilos. Like I have a tinier waist, and that always screw me up for strength. But I think with acute training, I can build myself back up correctly this time without, because like for example, bodybuilding has always crashed me. I would do 3 weeks of bodybuilding and just be tired all the time. But now I understand what that fatigue was. It wasn't physical. It was a somatic error grown too big. I will explain that in another podcast. So foundation of the Q training. The foundation of the Q training really is that Q means quit, fail, right? And the importance of that. So you've seen many top strength athlete telling you don't fail. Training to failure is failing to train. That the idea of pushing that extra rep is bad for you. Some, like the greatest in powerlifting, for example, had cycles where they did not miss a lift, whether their main lift, squat, deadlift, bench, or even their assistance work. They would write down a program 12 weeks and never fail a lift. And they explain that, like David Tate also talked about this, the importance of not failing. And so, which is weird because others tell you have to do one more rep, only start counting when it burns and everything. So which one is which? Which one is good? Which one is best? Are they both right, both wrong? Like, how does it work? And so for me, what matters is to understand the idea of the fail. Because when you say don't fail a rep, all right, but they are don't fail a rep physically, which means you cannot, achieve the bench, for example, right? Okay, but what if the rep before that is shitty? Like form breaks down, it feels like shit, nothing is good. Is that a good rep since you did it, or is that a bad rep, right? And so to me, that counts as a bad rep technically, but I'm going to explain to you why. So the key of the program is the fail is to not go into the fail, but not go into a specific fail. Some exercise you can take to failure, but it'll be physical failure and never mental failure. So what do I mean by mental failure? So to explain that, I need to explain the sense of self, right? And this has been my work for the last 3 months, especially, more than that, obviously, but that really taking shape in the last 3 months by using lactate measurements, right? I hope you guys don't hear the work behind me too much. I'll try to clean it up on the audio. The lactate measurements have opened up a door, a new rabbit hole on what the sense of self is. And this podcast will be that. I want to explain the sense of self as a function of the threat assessment system that we have, right? So let me explain all this. So the point of life is to fight death. Like whether we look at it from an entropy perspective, back to Carl Friston, all that stuff, really from a practical perspective, it means you need to survive. That's obvious, right? To survive, you need to establish a threat detection system, right? What is a threat, what is not a threat? That's fairly obvious. To establish that, you need to establish what is you, what is not you, right? So that's where the Markov blanket comes in, or again, all the work of Carl Friston. That's not just Carl Friston. Clark did a lot, but anyway. What is me, what is not me, right? That's not what you do as a kid. If you look like you bite your hand to know if it's part of you or not, you cry, you get food, is it part of you or not? So that's a social attachment to the mother. Things like this. It's integral to the human development, right? It's integral to even a cell, an amoeba needs to know what is it and what is not it, right? So, and that's what the membrane of the cell originally was. That's the Markov blanket for the cell, is that what communicates with the outside, but also gets information from the outside. That va-et-vient, as we say in French, inside to outside, outside to inside. So the sense of self, in a way, we're going to see the Markov blanket as well. So the threat detection system is so important for us as animals, right? Life needs a threat detection system. We see it everywhere. So dangerous, not dangerous. So we see many times on what evolution is working on at that moment through the energy being spent by this. What do I mean by that? That means the more a system is using energy, usually the more evolved it is. That seems to be the way it works. So for example, we saw that the brain is the part of the body that uses the most energy. 2% of the mass, 20% of the energy expenditure. So it's a fifth of the energy expenditure is just for the brain. So that's huge. In the brain, we saw that the networks at what uses the most energy. Out of the networks, the two that use the most energy is the default mode network and the executive control network. And we see that the executive control network uses more energy than the default mode network, therefore is more evolved. And that's what, through the work I talked about, is that the default mode network was created for us to live in tribes. Right? If you look like a snake does not have a default mode network, a snake has a simple control system when it comes to threat, right? Which means he has a bubble, right? An area. If you enter the area, he's threatened, he bites. Simple enough, right? It's a fight system. Anything that comes close gets bitten. All right, simple. That's a simple sense of self. There is me, my bubble. Anything outside of that is not me, I attack. All right. We are in need of a more subtle system, right? Because why? Well, reason number one, we live in tribes. So just living in tribes change everything. And that's a switch from reptilian to mammals. And this is the emergence of the vagus nerve, right? The vagus nerve, for example, allowed us to live as in tribes as mammals. Primates, for example, would need to be able to communicate the friendliness or animosity that I have toward you. Right, so that means that in order for you as a snake not to think I'm an enemy, I will need to communicate friendliness, and that's the control of the muscle of the face that tell you, look, hi, I'm your friend, right? Whether if I make a face and I frown, I'm indicating animosity, you're going to react to me differently, right? So that's already a far more subtle threat detection system, right? That requires a lot more energy, right? Vagus nerve control system, and so as society has evolved. And our tribe has evolved in number, in complexity, so as our threat detection system. Because now we are facing a complicated, for example, situation where the society has evolved faster than our body. What do I mean by that? Well, a bear is coming, that's easy, right? A bear is an enemy, it tries to kill you. Sometimes you don't have to fight it because it seems to be, but you don't need to socialize with it. You know not to go play with a bear outside of 3 crazy dudes in Canada. So it's a simple choice, really, like don't go play with a bear, right? Otherwise, at some point, you're going to die, right? Simple stuff. So that part is easy. Now, when you go with humans, it's not that simple because someone who's a danger to you now might not be a danger to you tomorrow. For example, work comes to mind, right? Someone is threatening you for a promotion, or to your boss is saying something he has control over your life, is a threat. But then at some point, you might go up in a company and now he's an equal. So instead of having a 1 or a 10, you're either not a threat or you are a threat. Now we're faced with like a 6, which means you might be a threat. I'm not sure, but I'm going to treat you as one. But tomorrow the situation might be different. So suddenly that sense of threat becomes tricky. Like now there's context into play, and you have to know that tomorrow might not be how you feel today. And that's the executive control system, which is allowing you to take an emotion, understand it, process it, and change it towards something positive as needed. Because again, before we used to fight the bear, the panthers, all that stuff. That's simple. Now we're fighting other humans. That's our competition is other humans, but we need them as well. So someone can be your enemy, but at the same time being needed. So that means that you want to dominate, but you don't want to kill. Right? So you want to dominate, but you also want to be not too mean, so that because you might need that person later. Right? So the complexity of the threat detection system has gone up, as our sense of self. So is there a relationship there? And that is where the lactate measurements come in. So I've been doing a lot of work on that in the last 3 months, and I had a few cases that were very, very interesting. Let me give you one. So I have a coach whose name shall remain unsaid because he allowed me to use his his data, but I don't know if he's okay with me using his name. So he goes into the sun for 30 minutes. So normal day, right? Just nice in Holland, so that's nice. He goes into the sun 30 minutes, nice and sweat, comes back home, tests his lactate, and finds himself at 20, something like that, 20 point something, let's say 20 millimole, right? That is extremely high as a measurement. You show that to a doctor, they send you to the hospital. 20 millimole is acidity. They say lactic acidosis. I mean, it's they say lactic acidosis, but that's incorrect. It's incorrect because lactate does not produce acidity. Like I made an entire video on it that I'll post, but lactate has nothing to do with acidity in that sense. Acidity goes up when lactate is being produced, but that's because of the translation from ATP to ADP that releases a proton that raises the acidity of the body, amongst other factors. Like if I go technical, the lactate, when it's being carried, uses certain transporters, and the MCT2 has a proton attached to it. So here goes acidity, and then the CO2 levels as you train, right? But it's not, lactate does not create acidity. It's just the production of energy creates acidity, and the production of energy is glycolysis, produces lactate as well. So you can see the relationship between lactate and acidity, but not the causation, right? Correlation, not causation. Anyway, so you're at 20 millimole, that's what they call lactic acidosis. So I will refer to it as acidosis, right? It's that moment where the level of lactate is so high, it threatens your body. So we see that number everywhere, by the way. You see it in, for example, when we test the gamma brainwave, we can see at 20 millimole is when the level of lactate is so high that it sends bursts of energy through the brain that disrupts the gamma brainwave that are required to keep the networks going. So that 20 is a very interesting number, and it happens that in all my studies on my coaches and my athletes, my one-on-ones, I saw that at 20 millimole equals the crash, which makes sense because it seems that 20 millimole crashes your gamma brainwave required for the network. So literally you get a lower level. I talked about that in another podcast. Also means that yes, you're at acidosis levels, which create a situation of acidity that your body will be very afraid of. Homeostasis is afraid of two things. It's acidity and temperature change. So at 20 millimole, you're in a physiological state that your body will see as dangerous. So, and we're talking about 30-minute sunbathing, nothing crazy. He was just in the sun for 30 minutes, getting a nice tan and a little bit of a sweat. So that's a crazy response, right? And so the question becomes, well, what does it mean? And so yes, it is one example, but I've seen that situation being repeated in a different context many times, and I'm going to explain. So we start talking with my coach. He's like, all right, why did you get such a reaction out of the sun? Is it because, so he reminds me that a month before that, he went to the beach with his friends, same thing, feels anxious, right, doesn't like the feeling of it, test himself, he's at 16, right, so still very, very high, probably close to his Verlet max, just from an interaction with friends at the beach in the sun. So normally there should be no issue, and yet, obviously physiologically, there was an issue there. So why that need for lactate? Why is the lactate so high? The lactate is so high because there is a need for it. So what does that mean? That means there is a need for fuel. Lactate is not a waste product, it's a fuel. So fuel for what? Well, for the fight mode. So that, because raise of lactate means rate of energy being produced and used, hence acidity. So that means that lactate shows us that a need for energy constantly going up. And I can tell you, I made a podcast about this, that raise in energy means that there is a threat being perceived. All right, so that means that high level of lactate, high level of threat perceived, not necessarily real, but definitely perceived. I'm like, all right, so you took that as a massive threat. Why? So we keep digging and we go, okay, so was it because you had your shirt off and you're sweating? Do you not like having your shirt off in front of everybody? It was like, well, no, because on the 30-minute sunbathing, I was at home, so it can't be that. I'm like, okay, interesting. Is it the sweating? You don't like to sweat? And then we keep digging. And then, because I'm trying to find why is a sense of threat so high, hence the lactate levels, whereas really they didn't seem to be a real threat. So that means that the perception of the threat was very high. So I was like, all right, so what is it in that environment that made you perceive a threat as such a high level? And so we keep talking, and then it reminds me that during the burn the questions, when his vision got blurry, he felt the same way. He got, he pushed really hard, blurry vision, test himself, he's at 22, 23, something like that. But the feeling was the same. I was like, all right, blurry vision. So was that the issue is that you could not see straight. Do you not like not being able to see correctly? And he was like, well, yeah, because to me that's I don't like it. It makes me feel like I don't have control of my environment. Like I cannot see threat coming at me. I cannot deal with things correctly if my vision is blurry. I was like, all right. So is that what your perception of a threat is? Is you need the visual, right? The visual data in order to know what your environment is like. And if you don't have that, you feel very threatened. And he was like, yeah, probably. I was like, well, okay, there's one way to test it. I want you tomorrow to go do sunbathing, 30 minutes, and put sunglasses on. And then we'll see. That way your eyes won't be affected, because it seemed like the eyesight was the key, right? He goes into the sun for 30 minutes, comes back, his lactate is at 1.8. Right. In itself, it doesn't prove anything, but at the same time, he went from 20 to 1.8 in pretty much the same situation. His day was the same. He woke up with the same levels of lactate. The sun is not necessarily that much hotter. Like it was pretty much the next day in the same order, right? So, of course, there's variance in the 2 days, but not enough to explain how he went from 20 to 1.8, if not for the sunglasses. And so I was like, all right, so it is very possible, and here we're guessing, obviously, that when your eyes don't work, when you lose your sight-ish, you know what I'm saying, that does not allow you to be in the state you want to be in for the rest of the day. Like that blurry vision means you feel very much threatened. And I was like, well, and he was like, yeah, that sounds about right. And so hence the sunglasses, and that's the result. All right. So, and then we started talking from there, and we realized that he felt very threatened, so in his sense of self, right? Because of his inability to keep his vision working the way he thinks he should. So we can see that this is a perceived threat, not a physical threat, but the perception of the threat is what matters. And if you look, that perception of the threat relates to the eye. So the sense of self is what? We have to understand that nature does not do anything for any reason. Like the sense of threat means that, the sense of self exists for a reason. So what is the sense of self? It's me and I. Me, like I feel this, and I go to the market. So it's very much body as an object and body as a subject. Body as a subject is this hand is mine because I can feel it, right? When I do this, when I touch, I feel something. This is my hand. But my hand is also mine because I can control it as an object. I choose to bend my fingers, therefore I can control my hand, therefore it is mine. It is me. First it's mine as an object, but then it gets integrated as me. Because again, as a sense of threat, I need to know what is me, what is not me. Right? So whatever is mine becomes me. That's just other podcast, I guess, but that's the way this works. So we can tell from a sense of self that the purpose, right, is to see that me versus others. So from a technical perspective, it makes sense that the sense of self is really a function of the threat detection system, right? And it becomes very, very interesting because, for example, that would explain why the heart is linked to that part of the brain that is the sense of the me. The sense of the body as a subject is linked directly to the heart. So the question would be why? What is the point of the sense of self, really, right? Why do we need to think in words such as I or me or things like that? There has to be a reason. And I think the reason is because the sense of self, the me and the I, is a function of the threat detection system that we have. Hence the heart. The second, like that, the most important organ when it comes to survival is the heart. It stops beating, you're dead, right? Is linked directly to the body as a subject, the sense of me. Right, so you could see that. And I think that's what the lactate is showing, because in the case of my coach, by the way, so the blurry vision seems to be the perception that drives him to a physiological state that is dangerous, right? So that means that the blurry vision takes him to a state where he's in acidosis. It's that much of a threat to that person. And you could say it's just him, but I have many cases where we saw exactly the same. By the way, just real quick, on this, there's another possibility of the blurry vision is My coach lives in Holland, right? So if you look like raining all the time, long winters, dark very early, he's always focusing 2 meters ahead of him all the time. He's living at home, he's training at the gym, he's working at the gym, so always focusing on very short distances. And then suddenly he was in sunbathers or at the beach. He has to focus on very long distances, kilometers or mile ahead. Is that dynamic change possibly affecting him to the point where he feel a loss of control? What I find interesting with that is after his sunbathing, he crashed completely. He had a feeling of very, very low energy. And this is another podcast I'm going to make, but fatigue is actually a somatic error that cannot be compensated by the automated system that we have. Actually, you feel fatigue most of the time, it's a freeze mode. You're not necessarily fatigued physically, you're just in a freeze mode because your body has automated systems that are supposed to adjust to the somatic error. And when they cannot, that's when it crashes because it indicates a major issue. And that's exactly what he felt like. He felt like a great sense of fatigue, a sense of crash after the 30-minute sunbathing. Yes, the sun does certain things, but not enough to explain such an energy drop on top of a 20 millimole lactate. You should not, again, we go back to 20 millimole lactate, also driving to freeze because of the acidity going up. So you could see there's an entire part there. And those rabbit holes led me to believe that, again, the sense of self is the threat detection system, which opens the door to many, many, many rabbit holes, by the way. That will go over this in podcast. But so for the Q training, it matters a lot. And again, you can say it's only one person, but it's not. Because I have another coach, for example, Nicole, that I talked about. When she had a bad fight with with her boss at work, right? That wasn't the problem because, like, for example, the Q training, we started with Nicole 3 months ago. Like, she hasn't been over 10 millimole in a month. She had fights with the boss where she felt just as bad about the guy. She felt just as angry. Measure her lactate level, she was at 5. Like nothing crazy. Even like she I don't understand. I feel the same way. I'm like, well, you feel the same way physically in the sense that you don't like the guy, you don't like the situation, and you're not supposed to like it. But the difference is, it didn't crush your soul inside. It didn't make you feel insecure. It didn't make you feel like you could deal with the guy. So you handled it correctly, mentally. And by doing that, your level of lactate went from 23 to 8. Why? Because your sense of self was not threatened anymore, which means the threat got downgraded. Right, and I know this is true. Why? Because through Q training, we lower the levels of lactate for Nicole and for a number of people that I'm dealing with. So, but then that becomes the very important question. That is the key concept of the Q training that I created after seeing all those results. Is that there is 2 levels of threat. There is the one where I don't like this and I deal with it, which is a 6, and then there is the threat where that feeling where that's touching my sense of self, right? And that one will drive you through the roof. What does it matter for training? Well, let's imagine my coach takes the 30-minute sunbathing, goes to train. He's already at 20 millimole, which means this training session is going to be murder. He's not going to be able to train because how could you possibly push past acidosis? He's going to feel like shit. He's already having a massive crash because his body can A, not deal with the acidity, 2, not deal with the somatic error becoming so good, which means he cannot train. This affecting performance. So let's push that further. Imagine you're training and for whatever reason, an exercise, a rep, maybe someone watching you, maybe the feeling of the rep, maybe you're afraid of hurting yourself or whatever, instead of being a threat, becomes a threat plus. It touches your sense of self, which trigger the big threat detection system that, boom, takes you to flight. What's very interesting about that is that's exactly the results we saw in the study that Wim did with his runners. So he did a study with marathon runners and testing what they call anaerobic threshold. It's not an anaerobic threshold, there's no such thing, and it's not the lactic threshold. What we see is that the level of lactate raises like crazy. And he asked people, like we're talking like 200 people, but like groups of 20s or 30s, I can't remember the numbers exactly. But the point was, this was the moment where people felt they were from hunting the run to being hunted by the run, literally. So they were okay by doing sprints, right? With interval training, with diminishing rest or stuff like that. At some point, they felt like they were being hunted by the run instead of hunting the run. And that's when the lactate shot up. So what I see out of that is a switch from fight to flight. That flight mode is when suddenly you go like, oh, I'm being hunted, right? So maybe that flight mode is actually when your sense of self is being threatened, because then the detection level goes from threat to threat plus. So is that switch from fight to flight is when your sense of self is being threatened? Is that the goal, the function of your sense of self is to detect the threat to threat plus? So whenever you feel being hunted, you feel attacked, but like not physically, but almost mentally in your sense of self. That's because it's the way, the function that we have to indicate a greater threat. And how interesting of an idea. And so, but what's very interesting about that is that people have different perception of threat. For example, a lot of you can do a 30-minute sunbathing and not get the reaction my coach had. A lot of you can. So, and Nicole eventually had a fight with her boss, sorry, but did not get that sense of self reaction. So that means that we have different perception of threats, and they're not always based on reality. They're based on us and how we see whatever is happening. And what I find very interesting that again is that's really the definition of anxiety. If you look at anxiety, it is explained as, for example, through what is called the anxiety sensitivity index. And that index is divided in three things: physical symptoms, social symptoms, and cognition symptoms. So physical symptoms is you do a rep like, I'm afraid I'm going to get hurt. Maybe not get hurt right this moment, but maybe I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, my back is going to hurt, and I don't want that. Makes you freak out. So makes you freak out. Maybe you do a rep and you go like, well, I look like shit. My technique is breaking down. I can't do that. That's cognition symptoms. That'd be me, by the way. And you'll see that cognition and physical usually are very much linked. Social, I do a rep, but they're looking at me because, I don't know, I'm sweating, I'm making a face or whatever, and that attacks your sense of self. That's the social symptom, right? Which, by the way, I'll make a podcast on that too. If you look, those are the three worlds we live in: physical, mental, spiritual, right? If you look, I believe those are the three forms of the sense of self, right? And that's what we see in the anxiety sensitivity index. So that means that for performance, for training, I cannot go into the fail. And that's what the Q-1, the Q training is understanding quit not as I can't do that rep, but instead understanding quit as I cannot go into this particular rep that provokes that threat plus, that provokes the flight. So that means that when I train, I cannot go into flight. I'll always have to remain one rep below flight, right? And that sounds very simple, but what I've seen, and that's why I think measuring lactate is so important, is that we all have a different trigger to flight. And I've seen that many times. You might not know which one it is, because I've seen people that could not tell if they were at 10 minimal lactate-wise or 25. I know it sounds crazy, but I had people I couldn't tell the difference between 5 and 15. If I train, they can, but mentally they cannot. So finding what your fail is becomes the most important part of your training, because again, if you train and you're at 10 millimole, it's one thing. If you train, do a rep and it doesn't feel right for whatever reason and it triggers that threat plus that flight response, then now you're in 20 plus millimole and your training is going to stop real fast. So, sorry, the dogs are barking, I hope you can't hear them. That switch from fight to flight is the key, and that's exactly what we do not want to see happen in the gym. I don't want you in flight, I want you in fight, the greatest fight possible, but never flight. And it seems that the flight is being triggered not necessarily by a physical thing, but more by I hate to say the word mental, but by a perception. That's what triggers the flight mode, far more than the physical part. So finding what your fail is becomes the most important thing. And lactate measurement is what's going to tell us. We're going to draw patterns, right? During your day life, morning, night, training, stuff like that, and find the type of fail that you have, like so physical symptoms, cognition symptoms, social symptoms. And when we find that, we are not going to let you go to flight. We're not going to let you take that rep. And hence why I call that the Q-1, right? Because we find the quit and then you stop always short of that. The quit is the trigger to flight. And after that, the Q+1, the idea was so I stop you short, so therefore volume can be increased, so I make you do one more set than you want to do, just to make sure that you can push, that you never fail your training, which means like you say, like I can do another set, I'm going to make you focusing really, really hard and do one more set so that you can beat the weight, but not 2 more sets, because otherwise you would quit again and then we're back in the same fail, right? So there's an entire idea there in the Q training that I'm developing, but it is all based on the idea of fail and not going to flight. And it's a lot trickier than it sounds, honestly. Like that's why, again, the lactate measurements, but not going to flight is the key. Since I've been implementing that in my training, for me the results have been crazy. Like I'm doing so much better. I can do bodybuilding, which I could not do before, without any issue. I've seen the results on Janina, who's going to start competing in powerlifting and will go to Worlds. You'll see, 2 years she's at Worlds. She's so strong. But I've seen that with my one-on-one, with my coaches, with all this. The Q training is a culmination of all my work, from the training, from the physical side, but also all my studying on anxiety, depression, prediction versus observation. All this is being put together into the Q training, and with that massive rabbit hole that is in sense of self, and that key argument of not going into flight in your training. That does not mean not pushing. It just means not going into that deep perception of threat. That seems to be the key, right? And so I feel like that's my life work, really, this thing. And so I started a template that I call the Q training template. It's on Mighty Networks. You can find it. Just sign up for Julian's Corner and then you'll have access to it. But that's really what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus that on Julian's Corner. You're going to see a lot of the podcasts on the subject. I'm still going to make podcasts about other stuff, but you're going to see that you're going to see me focus very, very hard on the Q training, because I believe it can be adapted to any sport, right? Because I believe it can be done with anything, because the point is the fail, is to identify the fail for yourself and not go there. That's applicable to any sport, any situation, really. And that's the key. That's the key to performance, but that's also the key to mental health. If you look at mental health, really, you can always turn it into 3 things. You're giving me a 1 when I need a 10. You're giving me a 10 when you need a 1, and you cannot give me a 6. So what does that mean? That means your threat detection system is whacked, which means your sense of self is not where it is. You're going to flight when you shouldn't, or you're going to freeze when you shouldn't. You cannot give me what the world is requiring you to give me, which is a 6. You get the idea, right, as a concept. And this is fundamentally so important, because we can help with mental health so much through that understanding of the fail, and between the lactate levels, which can also help toward the mental health part, because it can explain to us what the fail is. But for training perspective, for performance, I believe the Q training is going to be the most important thing, because how can you perform if you go into flight? You cannot. If you're at 20, again, I was explaining that in another podcast, like your brain cannot function properly at 20 millimoles. Like literally the networks of your brain are breaking down because the gamma brainwave cannot be maintained. So that acidosis is a crucial point. You cannot go into acidosis in your training. If you go, you're done. I mean, you can obviously, like burn the question, but then you're done. It's over, right? So it has a tremendous impact on you. And the fail, the Q, the quit, is the most important part. So determining what that Q is and how to use it in your training, to me, means that's the key forward. That's how we're going to get performance. That's how we're going to get mental health. That's how we move forward. This is the work. This is what I was looking for. I've been looking for a way for such a long time, like to have a system in place, but there were so many rabbit holes, so many holes in the system. I was like, no, not there yet. I feel I'm there now. I feel this is the key, and that's my work. So the Q training, that's my work. That's what I'm going to focus on, and I hope you come see it, man. Come on Julian's Corner. Like, this is the shit. Like, I can make a big difference with this. This is my life work. Like, the stuff works, man. I've seen it on my one-on-ones every time. Like, it's very impressive, right? I hope to see you there. Thank you, guys.